From the Homestead Studios in Santa Clarita, California, it's just the Tip-Sters with Melissa Morgan.
Wet-ass pupils.
Today with a special Murdertizer, an appetizer of murder, featuring Melissa's interview on the Don't Assume podcast with host Dave Kimball. Remember, if you've got a tip for Melissa on anything, tell us about it by calling the Tipster hotline at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837, or send an email to jttipsters@gmail.com. And now here's your host. She's got a hankering for a solid whodunit, and by that we mean, was it her husband or the dog that ate the one remaining golden Oreo she was saving for dessert? Melissa Morgan.
More cowbell. I think we know who enjoys the golden Oreos more than Siren.
I have no comment at this time.
Yeah. I think you do.
There is no comment.
I think we know who stole the last golden Oreo. That's all I'm saying.
I actually like the original Oreos better.
Well, then why didn't you eat those, you evil, selfish wonk?
Because the regular ones were buried at the bottom of the stack.
Well, dig a little deeper in the well, for God's sake.
And how do you know it wasn't
First of
the
all,
dog?
right, and it was never Siren. She does not have opposable thumbs and cannot open the packaging. First of all, those are for the porch. Those are for we leave a cooler with Gatorade and ice and a little pink plastic tub with chips and cookies for our delivery people and our landscapers and the HOA here. And
no, we don't. Melissa does because she's a nicer person than me.
And occasionally, producer Mark will just snatch a golden Oreo, which are my favorites.
As if someone else here doesn't ever do that.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
But they're mine. I peed around them.
Oh, that's why they tasted so different.
They're golden Oreos, Mark.
Oh,
what
right.
do you not get?
I'm sorry.
It's in the name.
Wow. Okay. Well, I won't be having any more of those.
We've devolved just greatly. So I need to explain wet-ass pupils.
Yeah,
and I'm happy it made you laugh. So my beloved Lorraine, host of the Big Feelings podcast, and I were speaking. There's this terrible, terrible app that she forced me to download called Marco Polo. And if you live far, if you live far away from, your friends, which I do, honest to God, I just don't have that many friends here. Most of my friends live in different parts of the world. I sound very sad. I'm not. I promise. It's just I haven't, I don't have a lot of people around that are like, my age, or we have the same interest, whatever. I'm a weirdo. So yeah, there's that. I don't have, we don't have kids.
Right. Well, the technology does make it possible for you to look at people and kind of have a regular conversation.
Right. And Marco Polo's fun. It's not exactly a regular conversation. It's not like Zoom or Skype or something. Because you record a little video for your friend and leave it. It's kind of fun. It's probably much more fun for introverts, which Lorraine says she is. I don't know that I believe that, but she says she's an introvert. But anyway, I'm a total extrovert. So I send her, videos of me in the shower. No, I'm kidding. I don't. So what happened was Lorraine was discussing her dry eyes. And I was like, huh. And I assumed it was an age thing, and she's much too young for dry eyes. And apparently it doesn't have to do with age. I've only known a few people who have the dry eye issue, and they use Restasis or something, or it makes tear duct work. Anyway, I have never had that problem because my eyes are remarkably, I started to say moist. I'm sorry.
Well, they are moist.
Oh God, I do.
Come on, you hate that word? Is that a word?
Yeah, it's a bad word. I don't like moist.
But your eyes are moist.
Stop now. You've said it twice. You're done. You're
moist.
cut off. I'm cutting your mic.
Moist.
I'm cutting your mic. I can't do it, but I'm still cutting your mic. So anyway, what happens is I cry a lot, happy, sad, whatever. But more than that, I have allergies. And even more than that, my entire life, my eyes water like a goddamn sieve. And so there are things that I can't do that other chicks can, like have a winged eyeliner, because I'll cry it right off. I don't mean like boo-hoo-hoo sobbing cry, but I mean, it doesn't matter. Waterproof eyeliner, it doesn't matter. It looks like poo. Plus I have hooded lids, which all the men are now like, click, click, click. They're completely tuning out. I get it. But anyway, what happened was Lorraine was talking about her her dry eyes. This is so fascinating. And then I was talking about my overly damp eyes. And then she sent me a video back and said, you bragging with your wet ass pupils. And I laughed until I almost hurt myself. So now I'm the old lady version of Cardi B. I have the WAP. I have the wet ass pupils. I see. So that's where it came from.
I got it.
So anyway, there we go. Also, we discussed, now everyone's going to tune out. So Lorraine was like, dry eyes. And she goes, along with other parts of her body.
Okay.
And I'm like, no. You're way too young for that, number one.
All right.
And number two, I'd gone to a gynecologist, and she said, oh, there's no sign of vaginal atrophy. And I'm like, thank you?
Oh, my God.
I know. I was like, first of all, I didn't know that was a thing. Second of all, don't even tell me if I don't have vaginal atrophy, because that's like...
Because now it's got you thinking about vaginal atrophy.
Yeah, which I did not know was a thing. But I have wet-ass pupils. Is that a squeaky toy?
That's a squeaky toy.
Oh, Siren.
We're just going to leave it in here because...
Can you hear it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my God, it's hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
Lord knows. I think it's the chicken. It's the big chicken.
It's the big chicken. Yeah. That's one of the few things she hasn't been able to destroy yet.
I apologize, Tip-Sters, if you hear a squeaky thing, because it's Siren Marie. At first, I thought someone was crying, and then I didn't know who that would be, unless it were producer Mark.
No.
But it is Siren Marie Morgan Humphreys, who has a squeaky chicken. So anyway, I got the wet-ass pupils, and apparently nothing below the waist is atrophied. Isn't that great? Are you happy? However, Lorraine said her gynecologist told her she had a wily cervix that apparently was like running away from her as they were trying to do an exam. It was like moving around. So I'm making her a shirt that says while period cervix. I'm making her a shirt with my cricket so she has a wily cervix, like Wile E coyote. That she has a Wile E cervix. So anyway, you look for that in the mail.
Oh my God! You ought to put a little picture of a little bomb.
Oh, okay.
A little lit
bomb. Okay. Thank God. I thought you were going a different direction.
That says Acme across it.
Yes. She has a Wiley Acme cervix. Thank you, producer Mark. Ideas. Hold on. I'm writing them down. You are a creative genius. So I got a hilarious, to us, not to this couple, a hilarious message from Tipster Allison, who sent me something from a publication that she got, and it is a letter to the editor, I guess, and it had caution tape, police line, do not cross across it, and it says, my husband and I unwittingly bought a house that was featured on the recently revived Unsolved Mysteries. Unfortunately for us, there are no laws or regulations in place that require the seller to discuss that the home was featured on a show, and we didn't think to ask, hey, did anyone who lived here mysteriously get murdered?
Dear.
We found out this information when we watched the show, all in caps, 3 days after we moved in and saw our house heavily featured.
Oh, my.
That is a homeowner named Maggie in Baltimore.
Dear.
So I wonder if it differs in every state, because
it does. Oh, it does.
Remember when we were looking and they had to disclose?
In California, you got to disclose everything.
It's within so many feet, like 500 feet.
Right. It's not just in the house. Right. It's like if somebody was killed out on
the street
in front of your house.
Right. Yeah. Right. It was the house we looked at, 13 years ago, across the street and next door, across the street and down one, a woman had been bludgeoned. Which is
we did that too. We did that.
We did cover Luana Clary is her name, and her husband, who probably killed her, died on the table after a heart operation, which is really a shame. Not really, except that he didn't leave a dying declaration. But it was how I got to meet Detective Hanky. So
it was.
That was a beautiful entree. Sometimes a terrible thing happens, and you get to meet a wonderful person. So speaking of entrees, I got to meet the host of the Don't Assume podcast in a Facebook group. His name is Dave Kimball, and he is just a delightful human being. And he is one of those rare finds that starts his podcast and out of the gate, he's good. He knows what he's doing. He sounds good. He's a natural storyteller. His curiosity is, I think, one of the things that makes that podcast even more interesting. He is interested in so many things. I always feel like I have a narrow cast. Like I like makeup, Mountain Dew Kickstart, and true crime. And he likes so many things, or is interested in finding out if he likes it, or interested in talking to people who do like it to see if he then might like it. I mean, he's the perfect host for that podcast. So it's great that he came up with this fascinating conceit. So I was really blessed because I thought we were going to talk about yoga and me being an oversized yoga instructor. And he's like, I really like the idea of talking about the fact that you host a true crime podcast. And I was like, oh, really? That's really boring. But, it was a wonderful interview, and he is a terrific guy. And you can hear the entire episode, which we have shared on our social media platforms. And you can find his entire episode under the Don't Assume podcast anywhere that you listen to podcasts. But here is my interview that I was so excited to get to do with David Kimball.
I'm very excited to introduce you listeners to the host of the Just the Tip-Sters podcast, a true crime podcast, my new friend. And I'm very grateful that she's become a fan of the show, Melissa Morgan. Melissa, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
It is my joy to be here, and nice to meet you, Davin.
You too.
What I love about Melissa's personality and about her podcast is that you'll hear in this interview that she's the life of the party, that she's fun and funny, and also she's appropriately respectful when it comes to talking about difficult things and actual people's lives that are affected by really traumatic things. And so, Melissa, first and foremost, why true crime? Why this podcast? You've worked in the entertainment industry for a long time. Why is this subject your passion?
I think it's been a passion for a long time. And I think Davin mentioned a few things he had listened to, and you mentioned the first 48 was an influence on you. And that was what I was watching just before we started this podcast. I still watch it. So why true crime? I think there are things that imprint on you as a youngster, and you may take them into your adult life as an interest, or you may drop them. Like you may want to be a veterinarian as a kid, and you may not when you get older. But I was pretty influenced by the book Helter Skelter as a much too young person who have read it. But after reading it, I became very, very obsessed with killers.
So speaking of that, have you read the book? I'm trying to find it. Dang it, it's in my library on Audible, but there's a book that talks about, there's a theory out there that Charles Manson and his followers were actually CIA operatives, or they were tested. They were test subjects for CIA LSD experiments. Have you heard that theory?
I have not. That's a good one.
I'll pass you the...
Is it like an MK Ultra kind of thing? Because conspiracies are really annoying to me.
Okay, so you don't like conspiracies,
no.
but you do like true crime. Talk to me about that difference.
They're usually bullshit, and they take up way too much time. And life is short, and you need to get to the real stuff that matters, the truth.
I agree with that.
Okay, so if it was always something you wanted to do, why isn't it something that you've always done? Because you started this podcast like 3 years ago, right?
Yeah, no, I didn't want to do it. And what you just sort of made a great point with conspiracies, and Davin made a great point with like the news. So here's what happened. I've always been interested in true crime, and I've always watched true crime documentaries, which you're correct. Most of them have an agenda. So documentaries aren't always the best place to get your information. But I had listened to the top rated podcasts and was so infuriated at the number of mistakes from a person's name to their date of birth or death or what exactly happened. And I was about to pull my hair out, and I was like, we're speaking about people's lives here, about their life and their death, maybe their death. And I couldn't take it anymore. So December of 2017, I said to my husband, I'm going to start a true crime podcast. And he's like, great. And I forgot about it. And then a couple days later, he goes, okay, the studio's set up. And I'm like, for what? And he's like, that podcast you're going to do. And I'm like, I'm not doing a podcast. And here we are 3 years later. We haven't missed a week. And I couldn't do it without him. He engineers, produces, records, edits, makes me sound better than I ever could. And he is my sounding board. And he puts himself in the seat of the listener. So while I'm plowing ahead with information that I know, not everyone may know about what's going on, or they may have a question. So occasionally Mark will say, hey, what about this? And I'll be like, thank you for asking that. And I can explain it. So it's, I'm the host, but he is the best sidekick ever in my mind. And he does the intro and outro, which I adore. And yeah, why haven't I always done it? Because I was never going to do this. I was never going to do this. And like you said, for the first year, I did only cases that were solved. I can't stand a case that's open. I hate it. I sit up at night. It makes me ill. I can't stand it. So I only covered cases that were closed until the listeners would say, hey, would you look at this case? Hey, would you cover this? This was in my hometown. This happened to a family member. And I put my toe in the water and I was pulled under by a big bunch of sharks. And here I am, mostly now covering cases that are either unsolved, missing persons, but I still occasionally put a solved one in there just to make myself feel better.
How much time do you spend researching for each episode?
It will depend on the case, but a lot more than I ever thought I would. I'll just say that. I don't want to be rude, but I'm just going to go ahead. There's a whole lot of podcasts who just do like, in the old days of the news, they would call it rip and read. And my husband has the funniest story about this very well-respected news person in Los Angeles who would be reading a story and my husband's looking at the LA Times like, hey, like hearing it at the same time while he's reading the exact. So I can't stand that sort of podcasting. And absolutely, when I first started, I did some of that and I would do some rearranging and I would check every source 2 or 3 times. I would never do something that I didn't have backup. If there was a piece of information I only saw once, I wouldn't say it. But, I did a lot of just like internet searching. And now I'm really blessed in that some of the listeners are in law enforcement and they appreciate how I talk about law enforcement. I've been called a bootlicking cop lover. And I'll take that. But what I really am is a person lover, I'm grateful to law enforcement, but I have district attorneys who listen, people in all walks of life. And I don't just say the cops are perfect. I call them on their shit. And I think that's why they like me maybe. Like I'm wearing my, and I didn't mean to, but it was just the perfect one to wear today. I'm wearing my hoodie that I got from the LA County Sheriff's Department Homicide Unit. So, I'm very blessed. I'm working on a case right now for a detective. It's a 1993 cold case, and it happened to be a couple of miles from my home. And he texted me on Tuesday and said, hey, are you familiar with this case? And I'm like, no. And now I've done a deep dive and I'm updating him every day and he calls me Grasshopper. And I'm like, oh, does that mean you're Kung Fu and you're going to die of autoerotic asphyxiation or something? But yeah, so, I love what I do and it's turned into something so much more than I ever thought it would.
What is it that makes your podcast more, so you're getting more the correct names and you're getting the correct dates and to be more respectful for, the people in the stories. What is it that makes your podcast different than the other ones? Because I feel like there's tons of them out there and there's a lot of, like you're saying, there's a lot of garbage that they just read the headlines.
So when I started 3 years ago, there were 400,000 podcasts. And I, at the time, thought 399,000 of them were true crime. There are now, 3 years later, 1.7 million podcasts, and I believe 1.6.9 million are true crime. You can find a podcast on how much you love your little finger on your left hand. I mean, it's every topic you could ever imagine, and a lot of things that are, in my mind, more attuned to something visual. But I'm much more auditory. You know, I went to school for broadcasting. I worked in radio. I love the theater of the mind. I love television, don't get me wrong. I'm just not as visual. I feel like I'm much more auditory. So I love a good storyteller. I love a good story. And I think at the beginning, you know, no offense that you're both men, at the beginning when you were talking about why people like true crime, a large audience of true crime listeners is always going to be made up of women. And I have a theory that it's because we're the ones who get killed more often. And there's lots of reasons why people listen to true crime. There, but for the grace of God go I. You know, it's like, oh, well, like you mentioned driving past a car accident, right? You don't want to look, but you sure can't stop from looking. So you listen to true crime because you're like, well, I don't want that to happen to me. Or that didn't happen to me. Thank God it happened to someone else, not me, but oof, that's terrible. I think there's a lot of women who listen to become more educated in how to protect themselves. And I think you're absolutely right, Davin, in that it's puzzles. People love to solve puzzles. And as far as when did we become obsessed with this, Dave, it's not recent. My grandmother had a subscription to True Detective magazine. And the 60s, maybe? 60s and 70s. My mother loved mystery books so much. A writer named Robert Ludlum was her favorite, but Agatha Christie for sure, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But she loved books so much that she, back in the old days before you young men were around, they used to have book clubs, like the Columbia Record Group thing.
Yeah.
My mom faked memberships by using my name so she could get more books. And so I would, like, I'm an adult, I'm in my 20s, and I go to her apartment, and I'm like, why is there a box outside your door that says my name on it? And she's like, oh, that's my new books. So she could only belong to so many book clubs in her name. And she would read like a 900-page Robert Ludlum book overnight. She was like some crazy, speed reader, and she loved them all. I liked stuff a little darker. She was interested in that too, but for the most part, she just loved a mystery, and she was brilliant and would try and solve them. So I think there's a lot of reasons why people listen. I loved your cousin Jackie's explanation that she needs some time in her car by herself away from her kids. I have this amazing listener who sent me an article from something called Broadly, a section of Vice.com, and it's about women for women. And it's a woman who did a really amazing study. There's a study from Sweden and one from the United Kingdom that said that people listen to true crime because it calms them. And at first I thought, well, no, that's interesting. And it happened to me. 2 weeks ago, I was having the shittiest day and I was crying my eyes out. And a friend posted on Facebook 11 facts behind the scenes that you never knew about Silence of the Lambs. And I'm reading it and I'm like, and I find myself like I stop crying and I'm calmed and I'm satisfied and I'm happy. And I was like, oh shit, that works. So some people do needlepoint, some people exercise, some people watch Hallmark Christmas movies, and some people listen to true crime.
I feel that same way. I enjoy horror movies, and they do the same thing to me. They calm me down. I don't know if it's because you're seeing someone that's having a lot worse day than you're having.
Exactly.
And so you're like, okay, things are okay with me.
These studies said that it's a lot of people with anxiety disorders.
Yeah.
Like extreme anxiety disorders. And I was like, I don't have that. Oh yeah, I do. And so, listening to true crime is like, maybe it's a distraction. Maybe it gets me out of my own head and makes me realize, shit isn't as bad as I think it is because I'm still here. I might be feeling weird, but I'm not dead.
Do you think it desensitizes you to stuff that you might see? Or do you find yourself being more or less sensitive or just no effect?
No, I don't think it. I think it depends on each person. I can tell you how I feel. If you've listened to a couple of podcasts, you won't go more than 3 or 4 of mine without hearing me cry. And I hate it.
That's true.
I despise it. I find it unprofessional. I get upset and angry. And I used to yell at producer Mark and say, cut it out. Cut it out now. Cut it all out. I just want it to sound like maybe I had a cold. And he did for a while. And then he said, you know what? No, it's authentic. It makes you who you are. Now, there are going to be people who listen who's like, shut up. This woman is a crybaby. And then there are maybe people who are going to understand who I am. And I love the fact that Dave gets me, who's known me for a week and a half, and gets me like he's known me my whole life. That, yeah, I have a sense of humor. We're all multidimensional people. I have a sense of humor, but I don't make fun of the victims. I usually make fun of myself. But I'm appropriately respectful in my mind, and I appreciated Dave's kind words when it comes to the victims also.
Yeah, what I like about your podcast, When You Cry, is that, like you say, you're trying to humanize the victims, and that what better way than to display actual human emotion when talking about it. And so I think it's really genuine, and I really like that about the podcast.
I appreciate that. And before we go back to true crime, I just have to say I love your podcast with all my heart.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I love it too. I'm having so much fun.
It's priceless. I'll just tell you, I wouldn't be here if it weren't, because I have been asked to be on, interviewing on a few other podcasts, and I have, politely been busy. And when I listened to yours, I was knocked backwards, which, my impetus for starting this was hearing remarkably popular podcasts that were piles of shit. So I'm a real picky bitch when it comes to my podcast. And when I heard the opening music of yours, I was in love. The more it kept going, you have a great voice. You have amazing guests. You have great topics. I learned something every episode. So yeah, I'm like your biggest fan right now.
Well, stop it some more. And you're one of those amazing guests that's on here now. I'm curious if you've learned or you have any insights into motives behind people who commit murder. Now, we talked about how Stephen Avery and Adnan Syed are like household names now. Do you think that all of this fervor is the word that I meant to say earlier, not furor, fervor around true crime and the attention that these are getting is a motivating factor for some of these murders? The Golden State Killer, for example, in the Michelle McNamara case, used to write into newspapers and say, "You're never going to get me." And, he had his calling cards that he would leave. But what kind of insights have you gained into the actual perpetrators of these crimes?
Well, I can tell you that I feel like everything is evolving. There's the 24-hour news cycle, which we didn't used to have, right? So now there's a need for content. Honestly, the heyday of serial killers was the 70s and 80s. The number of serial killers has dropped dramatically every year. As far as one person on one person crime, that's still obviously, a pretty big deal. And I would say most cases are someone who, someone is murdered by someone who knows them. Stranger or random murders are pretty rare at this point, because there's a camera on every corner. There's a digital footprint with your phone, and most people aren't smart enough to get rid of one or the other or all of those things. They're going to catch you. And now with DNA, there's amazing places like Othram Inc., Othram Labs in Houston, Texas, who are doing God's work, literally God's work. They're splitting the atom. They specialize. They only deal with law enforcement. They specialize in cases with very difficult or degraded DNA. So, I mean, and their theory is, their logo is, if you left anything at the scene, you're already caught. It may take a while. It may, they may have to work really hard, but they're coming for you. They're going to get you. So it's not, I don't feel like there's more crime more murders, more serial killers now than before. I just feel like there's more opportunity to talk about it.
I've always thought about the popularity of serial killers, how they used to, I don't know, make celebrities out of them. And I feel like
Absolutely.
they probably stopped doing that. And maybe that's why there's not as much serial killers, because there aren't these crazy people wanting to become celebrities. Or I don't know. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think everything it comes and goes in fashion. Like, oddly, the decades of the serials, 70s and 80s, don't know why, don't get it. Don't thought about that. There's the theories of nature versus narcissism. Are serial killers born? Are you born evil? Are your parents or your situation, is that the kind of thing that, builds you into a serial killer? I don't believe that. I think that being a human being is traumatic. The human journey, the human experience is traumatic. Do you take what happens to you and become a good person, or do you take what happens to you and act out and do something terrible that, will only make you feel better for a small period of time, and then you have to try and replicate that? So yeah, I don't, I'm not smart enough to have all the answers about that, but I just, it's not a good enough excuse. And if you don't have the right to take someone else's life. And if you do, right, you need to pay.
Yeah. I think that question of nature versus nurture is one that, you can explore in all kinds of different avenues. And maybe one day we'll have a better answer than we have right now. But I think it's most things are a combination of both. I found the title of that book. It's Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. Check it out.
Okay.
I listened to it on Audible. It's a little long, but it's interesting.
If you like conspiracy theories.
Okay.
If you like conspiracy, which we don't, we've already established. Yeah. That'll be another episode of conspiracy theories. But you mentioned Helter Skelter. You liked the Charles Manson. Chaos is an interesting book.
Okay.
Melissa, you talked about how not only are you doing a podcast, you do research, but you go out like on missing person hunts. Like, this is not just a fun hobby for you. Like, this is a huge passion, and it permeates your life, right?
It does. And part of the reason I started the podcast was a man in my area who went missing in January of 2017. And I did it because his wife is living my nightmare. Linda Sarazan comes home from work. She's an accountant at NBC Universal and has been for years. Comes home to dinner with her husband. His wallet, keys, phone, jacket, and truck are there, and he is gone. And she does not know. She spoke to him at 4:30. He was making chicken for dinner. She called again at 6:30 and said, I'm on my way home. She gets home at 7:30, and he is gone. And she doesn't know what to do, and she does all the right things, and it still turns out pretty shitty. And 2 days later, a neighbor says, oh, you know what? We have a camera that's aimed at your driveway. Would you like to see it? Why, yes, we would. And their nephew, who had lied and said he had left the home at 1:30, is seen backing his very unique SUV into the driveway at 5:06. The back hatch opens. You can't see what he is getting out of the house, but presumably it's Will, because Will's blood's in the back of his SUV. And he turns around and leaves, going in the opposite direction of his home. So he lies. His father lies for him. Will's brother, by the way. And it takes 3 years. And I will just tell you, I was given a tour of the LA County Sheriff's Department Homicide Bureau, which is the largest bureau in the country. I was given, Mark and I had the great honor to be given a tour last February. And I asked if the detective who had Will's case was available because I wanted to shake his tree. And the detective said, oh, do you know him? And I said, well, no. I've talked to him on the phone, but I think Will's case it's been 3 years now, and his case has fallen through the cracks. And who's gonna look for a 58-year-old missing man when you've been given the Natalie Wood case to reopen?
Yeah.
So This detective said, this seems like it's important to you. And I burst into tears. And he said, I'm going to take a look at it. And a week later, he said, you're right. It's solvable the way it is. And he kicked ass and took names. And I'll be damned if they didn't arrest Daniel, the nephew. And I've been to 3 of his preliminary hearings, and they keep getting, continuances because of COVID, but the next one's in March. And, I don't know that justice will be done, but I can tell you, all of us who spent months looking for Will, and I don't like the outdoors. I'm not an outdoorsy kind of girl. Walking around the canyons of Southern California with a PVC pipe to scare away rattlesnakes, coming upon bones that you think are Will and that's a goat femur. All of us who spent this time looking for him, who didn't know him, just a man from our community who's missing, all of us are feeling a little better that at least Daniel was arrested, and we can hope that the process works. So yeah, you're right. It isn't just my podcast. It's something that's important to me.
So I haven't listened to all your episodes yet. You have 3 years worth of episodes, but you started off on an episode that I listened to recently where you said, I have an update on this Daniel case. And they just put, now I have the story. That's very good to hear. I appreciate that. So that, 30 seconds or 90 seconds of story that you just shared, I think drew everybody in. Okay. That's a story. I mean, that's really emblematic of, that's what we want to hear in true crime. What's the most interesting story you've tackled on your podcast? And what did you learn about it?
I'm going to have to say one that was a surprise to me. So I'm originally from Kentucky, and no one believes that because I don't sound like a hillbilly, and no one in Kentucky sounds like a hillbilly. Anyway, I'm not sure why. Because
you don't have overalls on and you are wearing shoes?
Look, I teach yoga. I don't wear shoes a lot. Fuck both of you. These are my teeth. I haven't slept with a member of my family that you're aware of. I understand that, where there's smoke, there's fire, but some of those things are false, right? So
they're assumptions. They're assumptions that we make.
Assumptions, right. Thank you. That you should not assume. My mom sold real estate, which is one of the reasons I love the episode on real estate. So yeah, I did not know about this kid's case. He was 2 years older than me. Apparently we went to the same high school, but didn't hang out in the same crowds. And January of 2018, 2 different high school friends messaged me and said, hey, have you thought about covering the Randy Sellers case? And I'm like, well, who the hell's that? And I started looking in it, and August of 2020 was the 40th anniversary of this kid who's been missing. And the last people who had contact with him were the police. So I got way in deeper than I wanted to, and I'm still a little bit swimming around the cesspool. But I went back to Kentucky. I went home for a visit. I drove around, looked at places with my best friend. So yeah, that one is still the most interesting one to me. His parents are getting older. They need resolution. The people that know what happened to Randy are dying because it's 40 years later. There's still 2 officers alive who picked him up. The Kenton County Fair, which is where I grew up, Kenton County. He was at the Kenton County Fair August 16th of 1980. He was considered drunk and disorderly, 17 years old. He's a juvenile. An officer picks him up in a car that doesn't have a screen in the back. And apparently his explanation is that Randy got more belligerent and tried to hit him. So he pulled over, called for backup, and a second officer arrived with a car with a screen, with a cage. The sergeant at the station said, just take him home. He's a juvenile. His parents aren't home. He told them that. Probably should have taken him to the station to keep him until his parents could pick him up. They would have been home the next day. They drop him off. They say they drop him off a mile from his home as a favor. Because, of course, what you want to do to a 17-year-old kid you think is a punk who's hit you is a favor, right? Drop him off a mile from his home and he's never heard from again.
Oh, man.
Interesting. So, yeah, that's the most interesting case that I'm sort of digging around still, and I'm still involved, and more things are coming up all the time, and it's overwhelming.
Your podcast is called Just the Tip-Sters. You're all about tipsters. Do you feel like, Davin and I talked earlier about whether or not people who inundate the police with tips, and maybe inundate is too inflammatory of a word. Maybe it's not always just inundating them, but do you really feel like your tipsters who follow your podcast are making a difference and can make a difference?
Well, it is more than just a 12-year-old boy dick joke. I'd started as a joke, and then it became real. Yes, I get what Davin was saying, that officers get a lot of tips, whether it's from the news or newspapers or radio or podcasts, and a lot of it's bullshit. People calling in and saying, my brother's an asshole, my boyfriend killed this person, whatever. But I'll tell you something that's pretty magical. A 9-year-old cold case of an elderly couple murdered in their home. We covered the case in August of 2020, and I didn't find out for a couple of weeks, but after the podcast aired, someone called in with they call it unique information only the killer would know. And they're still running that down. I don't know what's going to happen. The detective keeps everything close to his vest, but he has become a wonderful resource for me, and he's helped me with other cases, actually. He's always available to take my call, my text. He's a delightful human being. He's one of the people that gives you faith and hope in law enforcement, and he's the guy you would want on your case. So as far as tipsters helping, and I loved, the keyboard warrior thing. If you've seen the documentary Don't Fuck with Cats, they solved the case. Some freaking tech nerds in different parts of the country solved a case of a man who could have gone on to become a serial killer and would absolutely have done that. They looked at lights. They figured out, like street lights, street signs, colors, the way the sun rose. They figured out he was in Canada. They tracked IP addresses. I mean, they were amazing. So I get that law enforcement probably has to wade through big piles of shit to find the piece of corn, but the piece of corn's in there, and sometimes somebody calls with a really good piece of corn.
What should people who are interested in true crime and who want to help, they potentially have a tip, or they're digging in, what guidance would you give them to be able to recognize the helpful information versus the non-helpful information, or the true information versus maybe the not so true? How did you know when you were listening to those podcasts that they didn't know what they were talking about?
Because I know a shit lot about a lot of cases, and they covered a lot of cases that were very popular and well-known. And I was like, well, that's wrong. That information's wrong. That's not that person. That's not how you even pronounce their name. I became infuriated with the amount of just like blasé attitude of just reading Wikipedia articles. It bothered me immensely. A beautiful thing has happened in the last couple of weeks. A young man in Wyoming sent me a beautiful Facebook message and said, I listened to your podcast and it changed me. He said, I began to have empathy for the victims and their family members. And now I've joined a group of people who search for missing people. And that, of course, made me bawl my eyeballs out. And he sent me a case that I'm working on that's amazing right now. And the detective is totally on board. The family members are on board. And it's a missing man who's been missing since 2018. So I'm not saying everyone has to get involved with boots on the ground. But one way to find out what law enforcement goes through is to volunteer. Whether you volunteer to hand out flyers if someone's missing, or, if there's a suspected crime of some sort, or whether you, get your ass out and crawl around some, dusty canyons to look for someone. Getting involved, and you don't have to do it forever. A little, I think someone on your podcast said, I think everyone should work in the restaurant business for a while. I thought everyone should work in retail for 2 weeks. Like, how the Israeli army, or in Israel, you have to join the army, like right out of high school. I feel like everyone should either work in retail for 2 weeks. You would never leave your fucking Starbucks cups in a dressing room again, or your baby's shitty diaper. I worked my way through college in retail. Or if you might have to work in a restaurant, and you would never be rude to your server again if you did that. I think if you got your hands dirty and looked into what law enforcement goes through, you would be able to weed through and not call in and do stupid shit and say, my boyfriend killed this person. But the other thing is, if you see something, say something. That's the thing. People sometimes wait years before they come forward. I'd like to believe everything happens for a reason when it's supposed to, but I'm also the person who thinks you ought to jump on it immediately. And if you even have an inkling of something that you think isn't right, fucking say something. Don't doubt yourself. If you think it's not right, it's probably not right. Say something.
Do people not say something because they are unsure or because they're trying to protect somebody? Why do you think it takes them so long to say something?
Those are great questions, Davin. I think there are obviously sometimes people don't say something because they're afraid for their own safety. They think that, it'll come back onto them. There are people who don't say something because the person they might have to say something about, they don't want to see them punished. But I'm a firm believer that things are going to weigh heavily on you. Like, I'm so shocked when people die and don't say what they did and take their shitty secrets with them. I'm like, how do you do that? How do you do that? But they do. Not everyone has, that kind of a conscience. But I think there's a lot of reasons why people would not come forward. But I'm just grateful for the ones that do.
Melissa, give us your plugs. Where can people find you and your podcast?
You can find Just the Tip-Sters. There's a hyphen. It's just the Tip-Sters. You can find us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, any place that you catch your pods. You can find us on the place I hang out most is Facebook. And I love the fact that you think Twitter is a cesspool. That's one of the things I love about you, Dave, because Twitter is a fucking cesspool. I do have a Twitter account. Someone asked me about it today, and it's JT Tipsters Pod. That's the handle there. And Instagram, it's JT Tipsters. And I, do occasionally Instagram, but mostly we have a Facebook page, and that's where I get most of the love.
Well, thanks so much for your time, Melissa. This is fascinating. I'm going to have crazy dreams tonight. And this was fun. Thanks so much for spending the time with us.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you both so much. It was such a joy and an honor to get to be interviewed by Dave Kimball because he's such a stellar human being. And I'm much more comfortable, as you can probably tell, on the other side of the microphone. So I'm not great when people...
That's nonsense. You sounded great. No, you really did.
Well, I'm much more comfortable asking the questions, but it was such a nice thing to try something different. And Dave helped me figure out some things that I might assume that I am wrong about. So his podcast is great, and I hope you'll listen to all of his episodes because they're all interesting and different in their own way. I hope you enjoyed this Murdertizer, and we'll see you next week on a regular episode of Just the Tipsters and more cowbell.
If you'd like to support this podcast, go to patreon.com/Just the Tipsters.